Oh, welcome everybody. I'm excited to have you all here. It's been an amazing conference so far. Dr. Blake and I were talking about we've gotten lots of valuable information and tools, and hopefully we'll be able to add to that repertoire of information you're going to get away from this conference. With that context, I'm going to be talking about the art and craft of doctoral writing. It's something I cover at residencies every Monday with our learners and chairs that are there. It's something near and dear to my heart. And I work with here as well as an editor for a journal. So as we all know, writing is really critical for our doctoral learners with their dissertation. And I'm going to talk about it from a little bit perspective than earlier. I'm going to talk about it, and I put together these PowerPoints both for faculty, chairs, and learners. So hopefully they're flexible enough for you to use them in all different ways. And so let me talk a little bit about the focus. And you'll see the bit.ly link is here as well in the slides. But in terms of today's focus, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is that doctoral level scholarship. So just to rephrase, I'm talking a little bit about the scholarly writing kind of for our doctoral learners. And I put this materials together for our chairs and our learners to use early on and throughout the process. After I talk a little bit about, so what is scholarly writing is how it's a little bit different when they get into the dissertation classes. I'll go through some tools and tips and approaches that I share with our chairs and share with our learners as well to help them develop those skills in a simple and structured manner. Also want to talk a little bit about unethical behaviors. We're all familiar with plagiarism and stealing words from authors' mouths. We see a significant issue with learners with putting words into the author's mouth, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The next thing I want to talk about is that environment. Often learners at the doctoral phases need to be writing 10, 15, sometimes 20 hours a week. So they need the right environment. I'll talk about what I've learned that to be from many of my learners since I've been involved in the doctoral program for
Got muted again.
June, do you on your end, can you unmute? I don't know why it keeps on doing that.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. I'll try to watch for that flashing sign. So with that, let me talk a little bit about how we talk about the doctoral level writing at the dissertation level rather than in some of their prior classes. And it's kind of work in progress. It builds over time. Once they're actually working on the prospectus, proposal, and dissertation, we really need them to focus on perfecting their argumentative writing. At this level, they are presenting arguments. Why this methodology? Why this problem statement? And they have to be able to justify it with evidence from the literature. It's not just about talking about what's been done, it's presenting arguments and points of view that they're going to prove. The structure here becomes even more formal than it may be in classes, and it needs to be logical. There's very specific criteria that they must meet in order to get these documents. So it's often a challenge for us to get them away from the idea of free flow writing, creative writing, and get them into the structured argumentative writing, which is critical. So we begin to build the skills of even more directly presenting their positions, the arguments to support the positions, the evidence from the literature, and making that specific to their study, not just generic arguments, and ensuring they don't bring their personal agenda and personal perspectives with them unless it comes out of the literature. The next, and we constantly are saying to learners in our classes and our coaching and in the residencies, use the jargon of the discipline that they're doing the dissertation in, whether it be the DBA or the PhD or the EDD, and make sure that they're learning that jargon by reading and reading and reading empirical articles. The other point we need to constantly reinforce is to make sure they are bringing in an unbiased perspective. When looking at points of view from the literature, they should be looking at the pros and the cons of the perspectives they are looking at. And we need to get them to personally pull out those personal experiences and agendas. We've had some learners in dissertation classes that say, well, I just want to prove that the principal is not a competent leader. There's a bias and agenda, and we often have to coach the learners away from that in their writing. Another point, which is really essential, is to help them keep it clear and simple. The people reading a dissertation aren't necessarily in their field. They can be in many different fields. So we constantly reinforce it, keep it clear, concise, and it requires a lot of discipline because it's often easier to write a lot rather than write it focused. Another key point is that at the scholarly level, at the dissertation level, the scholarly writing should be developed as an art and a craft. And so that needs continued practice. And we ask them to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit more. So where do I ask or suggest learners to apply it? When I'm at residency, I tell them, apply the scholarly writing from the first courses you're in the doctoral program. Great place to apply it is the DQs. Craft well-developed DQs. You do that for a couple of years. And when you get into your dissertation class, you're going to be a master at the art of doctoral writing. Do it in your research papers. And then as you're developing the different dissertation artifacts, use it consistently. So what do I mean by a structured research process? And how do we encourage the learners to use it, as well as how do we encourage our chairs to coach our learners on it? Because predominantly our chairs serve the role of coaches. So we suggest that early on, if they're teaching classes, suggesting the DQ, the research papers, and the dissertation artifacts, that they focus that it is always done step by step with clarity and simplicity, that they have to use an argumentative approach. They're not just stating what's known, rather they're presenting a point or a position. Here's the best way to do thematic analysis. Here are the two alternatives that were considered in defining the problem statement. So it is about presenting that and then giving their arguments and citing basically the literature, and the citation serve as evidence, very much like a lawyer would use. And we remind them they must use the rubrics if they're in the classes, and definitely use the criteria table to craft the logical flow of each of their sections within the dissertation deliverables. They're there for a purpose. We're one of the few universities that really have done a great job in providing these templates with clearly defined criteria to make it easier for our learners to focus on the research and not have to focus as much on deciding how they're going to present it. And the last thing, and I reinforce this with my learners and with our chairs, writing has to be a habit. This approach to writing has to be a habit. I actually had one of my learners who previously graduate tell me about how she used this process to teach one of her kids how to create a 3-paragraph paper in one of their high school classes. So it's not all that different than what we've learned in high school and college. It's just that we tend to forget it, and we need to reinforce it with our learners. So the steps that we use to try to make this clear, I've found over the years that many of the learners, although there are rubrics in the classes and there are criteria tables in the dissertation artifacts, they just don't tend to use them. So it's about reinforcing, go back, find that rubric, find those criteria, and you have to use them. Oh, they use them in different degrees in their papers and classes. There is no exception to meeting those criteria in their dissertation. The chair checks for it, the committee checks for it, the AQR reviewer checks for it. The SDA supervisor may be involved as an AQR reviewer and they check for it. So we say, here's a nice simple process. Review the rubric or the template. Make sure you understand it. If you don't understand it, don't assume you do. Go ask somebody in the committee. Next, read through the criteria. They're in the table. They're generally in the order in which you should be using them. Use them. And we actually say, list them and develop one or more topic sentences of how you are going to address the criteria. These are the major points or positions they're arguing. And generally, because at the doctoral level, they're not just reporting other research, the general suggestion is that the topic sentence should not include a citation. The topic sentence is a point or a position they are making. It is not a point or position they're phrasing from somebody else's research. But then they go and they craft their arguments. How are they going to prove that point? Well, it's going to be a series of arguments, and then they're going to bring in citations from the literature. So they have to craft those paragraphs. As they're crafting them, we often find that they don't necessarily put them in a logical order. Sometimes they're not aware of what all the steps are. They haven't really mastered, let's say, the steps for thematic analysis, or they haven't really thought through all the steps for data collection. So we get them to continually relook. What is the order in which you will do this work? What is the order in which the argument should be presented? And then finally, we ask them at the end of each paragraph that they develop a transition sentence. Since at the doctoral level, many of these artifacts are first worked on with the chair, then reviewed with the committee, then go to AQR, and ultimately end up in Deeds Read, it really is important that they guide each of the readers through their logic, and transition sentences and topic sentences help do that. I know when I do an AQR review and it's well written, it is really easy to understand the points the learner has made, and it is much more likely that they're going to get a favorable review or have much fewer changes needed. So the structure follows them from the artifact through the review process, and it's really critical. What I'd like to do right now is actually take you through a tool I've developed over the past couple of years, and I've trialed with, sometimes I get a learner who may have not passed AQR reviews a number of times, and they're on their last choice or chance to get through AQR. And I pick them up as a chair and have to do a lot of writing coaching. With new learners, they may have good writing skills, but they may not have the argumentative skills. And they haven't really thought, well, what's the quick and easy way to structure every single section? So I put this tool together as a way to teach a learner how to write a series of paragraphs within any of the doctoral artifacts, the prospectus, the proposal, or dissertation. And let me kind of walk you through it. First page shows the first paragraph, second page shows the second paragraph, and third page shows the third paragraph. This happens to be what they do or write to justify the selected methodology for their dissertation in chapter 3. But it could just as easily be used in a classroom if they were doing some work on their 10 points and they were just beginning to justify their methodology. So the first thing I asked them to do, step 1, go into the criteria and identify it. In this case, the criterion said, identify and justify the methodology from the literature on methodology. You then write a topic sentence to address the criteria, and it should be a point of position you're going to argue. So in this case, the optimum methodology to study the relationship between variables in this study was quantitative. Made the point, now you got to prove it. So that goes into developing the arguments and presenting the evidence from the literature. Often we see learners when they first do this, all they do is put in citation after citation after citation. They forget step 3. They haven't actually shown how it relates to their dissertation. So the first argument here is the focus of the study was to examine if there was a relationship between the variables of emotional intelligence and job engagement. Evidence for this statement would be quantitative methods can be used to define relationships between variables, cited by Mertens 2010, which was the focus of the present study. I also use this one sentence to illustrate, be very careful where you place your citation. I've placed it in this case after what Mertens actually said. Learners tend to just drop it at the end of the sentence, and Mertens never said, which was the focus of the present study. So crafting these sentences to have an appropriate set of evidence, they have to think about carefully. Next argument, the results were expected to generalize the relationship of emotional intelligence and job engagement to the population of special ed teachers in Arizona. Evidence, quantitative research should be conducted when there is an objective to examine an existing condition with the intent of generalizing to a larger population. And then the third argument, which is sufficient to prove what's needed in this paragraph, is validated surveys appropriate for the target population were available for both variables, with the supporting evidence that quantitative research requires the variables to be identified, and the data collection procedures must include surveys or measurements that will produce numerical data and cite it. Now it's time to go to the next paragraph. Note that if you count the number of sentences here, it's going to be about 8. Good length for a paragraph, and you can probably keep it under the 1 page that APA requires that it remain under. So now, transition. You go from the position of this paragraph to the position of the next paragraph. The position here was quant is the best approach based on methodology literature. The criterion in the next one asks them to justify it from related empirical studies as opposed to methodological articles. So now you transition. While quantitative methodology is ideal for methodology articles, it is also the best alternative from similar empirical studies. That then brings them to the next paragraph, which now the criteria in the second paragraph in this section in their proposal or dissertation is identify and justify the methodology from similar empirical articles. Same thing, develop a topic sentence. Prior similar studies also use quantitative methodology. We go through the same process of argument and citation, but now they're relating their arguments and developing their arguments based on the literature, but specific to their study. So the argument is the focus of this study is similar to studies looking at emotional intelligence and job engagement across different target audiences. Supporting evidence. A vast amount of previous literature using emotional intelligence and variables similar to job engagement variables use quantitative methodology. In this case, you will notice there are 3 citations. I really caution our learners, somehow they've gotten the perspective, more citations means stronger argument. I've cautioned them, it is very unlikely that all 3, 4, or 5 of a set of authors they cite made the same point, and reinforce that they need to make sure they are paraphrasing what the author said and not what they hope they said. So that then goes to the next argument, which I won't go through. And then finally, there's a transition in step 5, one more time. This was based on similar studies. The next one section asks them to identify why qualitative is not appropriate. So the transition was, not only is quantitative methodology ideal for methodology and now empirical articles, qualitative would not address the proposed problem statement, which then brings them into, they need to get into the last paragraph. And here the focus is they have to do the alternative argument, which we often ask them to do at the doctoral level. Not only did you prove quant was good, now it's time to prove qual isn't as good. So they identify and justify why the alternative is not appropriate with a topic sentence like qualitative methodology is not appropriate to study the relationship between variables. Great point and perspective, easily supported from the literature, as you will see with those two arguments. So once again, argument and citation. And then finally, at the end, in step 5, they identify the transition to the next paragraph, which in the doctoral templates is actually next section, is a section on their design. So it would be, not only is qualitative not appropriate as a methodology to examine what questions, such as the relationship between variables, quantitative methodology provides an appropriate design for looking at the relationship of the variables, such as a correlation design, and that is their focus for the next section. So I mentioned I wanted to talk about ethical and unethical writing practices. We're all familiar with the idea of making sure that they are not plagiarizing. So crediting the authors for their ideas, they've pretty much perfected this or close to. The only thing that is sometimes an issue is they don't paraphrase it appropriately. So this is where I cover, you really need to paraphrase it appropriately. And there's also something we have started asking, or at least I ask my learners and chairs to do. Have the learners leave in the page numbers for paraphrased information. And here is why. One, APA says that doesn't say you can't have them, but it allows the learners to do two things. As an AQR and peer reviewer, I will almost always ask the learner, give them 5 or 6 citations and say, show me where you got these. And about a third of the time they can't. And that's become an issue with some learners because they're paraphrasing what they believe the author said in the article overall. They're not paraphrasing actually what they said. So I suggest that if they are working on their prospectus, proposal, or dissertation, that they leave these page numbers in. The chair can check it, the AQR reviewer can check it, and if we ask them to rewrite it, they know where it is. You don't want to rewrite something that's been paraphrased. The second thing is an issue that we're seeing more and more with learners as we get into the rigor of checking out their citations. They are actually putting in a paraphrase of what they think the author said. In some cases, when I ask them, why did they put it in? Well, it's obvious that that's what the author meant, so they can't even say where they said it anywhere. And often they're putting in, particularly like in justifying their problem statement or their need, or now the problem space, they're putting it in to justify what they hope the author meant. So I kind of have this phrase with my learners: do not steal words from an author's mouth, that's plagiarism, and do not put words into an author's mouth they didn't say, that's unethical, and just as unethical as plagiarism. So that goes to creating the right environment. Not only do you be able to write, organize it, make it address all of the templates that we give them. As learners get into the doctoral level of writing, and often I've talked to learners, sometimes they'll sit down for an hour or two, sometimes they'll sit down for a whole Saturday or Sunday, because the kids are away, they have the time, they're in the mood. And so we talk a lot about what's the right space. So in space, keep it away from distractions. Or like me, I happen to like them. I'd rather write in Starbucks with lots of noise. So either stay away from distractions or add them. Comfort, make sure it's a comfortable chair. Make sure your computer is positioned so when you're sitting up straight, your eyes are at the middle of your screen. Get the right mood, the right background, the right noise. You will notice my background for this presentation comes out of Harry Potter. kind of the right mood or for scholarly writing, at least from my perspective. And then think about what motivates you. Maybe it's a picture of you walking across in your cap and gown that you know you're going to walk across our virtual stage in. Maybe I have a toy that my dissertation chair gave me 40 years ago, has a bow tie just like he did. And when I get mad, I can shake it by the neck and it screams. So it kind of something that I like to do when I'm really frustrated as I'm writing an article. Have the food and toys and the energy you need. You need water, you need food, you need toys, especially if you're writing for long periods of time. The other thing is the materials and equipment. And I have long conversations with my learners about, are all your materials going to be on the computer? Most of us at residency will talk about how when we actually start writing a dissertation, you really have to figuring out how to use 8 or 10 articles. Some of us who come from an older period of time want hard copies so we can paste them all around our rooms. Articles, make sure you have all those you're going to use, and hopefully you've highlighted them and you know what information you're going to use. And then take the time to engage your friends and family. Michelle Sandoval did a dissertation on the resiliency of our doctoral learners, which if you haven't seen it, you really ought to. It's great ideas for coaching learners on this dissertation path, especially for writing. Rather than separate yourself from your family, maybe you want to engage them. Get the learners to engage peers, other friends, cohorts, could be via Zoom. I've had groups that have set up groups over Zoom for writing. And so engage the resources around you in this process. And so the other thing that I cover and really try to actually coach my learners to do as I get on with my weekly Zoom calls with them, make sure you're celebrating every single success and do it with your friends and family. So I've taken what I've just covered and turned it into a set of principles, which actually some of my learners have made little mini cards of. Write it right the first time. Take the time to write it to structure, because you're going to pay me now, pay me later. Either do it right now or you're going to do it right later, but you're going to do it right. The other is create the right space, right peers, right environment. Read and synthesize the empirical literature. You need to read it, and it's not about starting to read it when you're writing about it. We give them templates. Sometimes they kind of peruse them. They don't use them. They don't use the critical tables and criteria. So we say, don't just peruse the templates, use them. Next one, focus on the criteria. Don't get distracted by personal beliefs, biases, agenda, or get into research overload and do 10 times as much research as you need. Craft each section and paragraph carefully and thoughtfully. That avoids missing criteria and avoids a lot of rewriting. I have found that, like for chapter 2, which could take some learners a year to get done, using this process has allowed me with some of my recent learners to get them through writing chapter 2 with only one revision with me and one revision with the committee. That saves months. Keep each section, and I penalize my learners to no more than 1 page over the recommended length. Less is more, and I found through my experience that if they're writing, it's probably because they don't really know what to focus on. Ethically, don't steal words from an author's mouth, and don't put words in an author's mouth. They should use jargon, but don't use it to try to impress people. And make sure you're editing. Keep focus, clarity, and brevity. I suggest to my learners, I really don't want to see sentences more than 3 lines long because they're less likely to have problems, etc. So that puts me at 3:30. And here is all of my contact information. Feel free to reach me, and thank you. I appreciate everybody joining our session.
Thanks, everyone. I am heading to the next